What kind of surgeon drives like a maniac? You're not saving anyone tonight. Officer Rick's mocking voice cut through the cold night air as Dr. Marcus James stood cuffed on the side of the road. Little did Rick know, the life hanging in the balance was the son of his own police chief, and Marcus was his only hope. The cool night air pressed against Marcus James as he paced in his living room, cell phone to his ear. The voice on the other end was urgent, a nurse from the hospital explaining the dire condition of a young boy, the son of the city's police chief, who had suffered a traumatic injury. Surgery was his only chance. Marcus, one of the top surgeons in the state, was their best hope. "We need you here in 20 minutes, doctor." "James," the nurse pleaded. Marcus hung up, grabbed his medical bag, and bolted for the door, his mind laser-focused on the task ahead. Every second counted. Marcus raced through the quiet suburban streets, his car cutting through the night. His thoughts whirled. What kind of injury? Was the operating room prepared? He had faced countless life-or-death scenarios before, but this one felt different. The patient was a child, and every moment of delay could mean the difference between life and death. Marcus glanced at his watch. Time was slipping away, but he felt a cautious optimism. He was good at his job. Damn good. And he knew he could save the boy. The streets were eerily empty, save for the occasional flicker of headlights in the distance. Marcus's car sped down a familiar route. He hit a red light, drumming his fingers on the wheel, his mind replaying every possible step of the surgery. Just then, he spotted flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. Two police cruisers emerged from the shadows, their sirens blaring as they closed in on his vehicle. Marcus felt his chest tighten. "Not now," he muttered under his breath, pulling over to the side of the road. As the cruisers came to a stop, Marcus's pulse quickened. He knew the routine all too well. In his neighborhood, a successful black man driving a luxury car often raised eyebrows. He reached for his driver's license and registration, hoping this would be over quickly. Little did he know, the clock ticking toward the boy's survival was about to face a new, unexpected hurdle. The squad car doors slammed in unison, and two officers approached Marcus's car, flashlights blazing through the tinted windows. The lead officer, a stocky man with a hardened expression, tapped on the driver's side window with deliberate force. Marcus rolled it down, his hands visible on the steering wheel. "License and registration," the officer demanded curtly, his tone devoid of courtesy. Marcus complied, handing over the documents with steady hands. "Officers, I'm a surgeon on my way to the hospital. A child's life is at stake, and I need to get there urgently," he explained, his voice calm but tinged with urgency. The second officer, a wiry figure with sharp eyes, circled the car, shining his flashlight into the back seat. "What's the rush?" he sneered, ignoring Marcus's explanation. "Speeding through a quiet neighborhood at this hour, huh? Where are you really heading?" Marcus took a deep breath, suppressing his frustration. "I just told you. I have an emergency surgery to perform. Every minute counts." But the lead officer wasn't interested in explanations. He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "We've heard all kinds of excuses. Step out of the car." "What?" Marcus's voice tightened. "I've done nothing wrong. I'm trying to save a child's life." "Step outside. Office the car," the lead officer barked, his hand moving to his holster. Marcus exhaled sharply, opening the door and stepping out. The officers wasted no time, frisking him roughly against the car. The indignity stung, but Marcus focused on staying composed. "This is unnecessary," he said, his voice measured. "You have my license. You can verify who I am." The wiry officer smirked. "What? You think just because you've got a fancy suit and an expensive car, you're untouchable? We've seen plenty of guys like you." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Guys like me?" he echoed, a steely edge creeping into his tone. The lead officer ignored the remark, pulling out a notepad. "What's in the bag?" he asked, motioning toward Marcus's medical kit in the passenger seat. "Medical equipment," Marcus replied. "Open it," the wiry cop ordered, his hand still resting on his holster. Marcus hesitated, his stomach churning with frustration. He unzipped the bag, revealing surgical tools and scrubs. The officers exchanged a glance, their skepticism unabated. "You could have stolen this." the wiry officer muttered. I'm a surgeon, Marcus reiterated, his patience wearing thin. If you don't believe me, call the hospital. They're expecting me. The lead officer scoffed. Expecting you to save the day, huh? What's next? You're going to tell us you're saving the president's kid? Marcus glanced at his watch, panic creeping into his chest. Time was slipping away. The little boy waiting for him didn't have the luxury of enduring these officers' power trip. Look, Marcus said firmly, you can detain me if you must, but that child doesn't have time for this. Please, let me go. Instead of listening, the lead officer pulled out handcuffs. Hands behind your back, he ordered. Marcus stared at him, incredulous. You can't be serious. Failure to cooperate, the lead officer said coldly, snapping the cuffs around Marcus's wrists. As Marcus was shoved into the back of the squad car, he felt a mix of anger, fear, and helplessness. The clock was ticking, and he was powerless to stop it. He thought about the boy lying on the operating table, his parents waiting for news, and the hospital staff scrambling to hold things together. Through the squad car window, Marcus caught a glimpse of his reflection. His composed exterior belied the storm brewing within. For the first time in his life, he felt utterly helpless, not because of his abilities, but because of the prejudice standing in his way. The lead officer climbed into the driver's seat, glancing at Marcus through the rearview mirror. Bet you didn't think your night would end in jail, he sneered. Marcus stared back, his voice calm but resolute. I'm a surgeon, and you just arrested the only person who can save that boy's life. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The wiry officer frowned but said nothing, his earlier smugness replaced with a flicker of unease. Unbeknownst to them, a colleague's frantic voice crackled over the radio. Dispatch to Unit 7. Chief O'Malley's son is critical. We need Dr. Marcus James at the hospital immediately. The officers exchanged a glance, the weight of their actions dawning on them. The air in the hospital was heavy with tension as Chief Alan Monroe paced outside the pediatric operating room, his usually commanding presence now diminished by worry. His son, 8-year-old Caleb, had been rushed in with a life-threatening condition. Nurses tried to reassure him that the on-call surgeon, Dr. Marcus James, was en route. But every passing second felt like an eternity. Desperation clawed at him as he clutched a crumpled photo of his son, praying silently. Meanwhile, miles away, Marcus sat in the back of the squad car, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. His pleas to the officers to let him go had fallen on deaf ears. Rick, the lead officer, rummaged through Marcus's car with exaggerated thoroughness, taking his time while making snide remarks to his partner. Surgeon my ass, Rick muttered with a smirk. The radio in the squad car crackled, breaking the moment. Dispatch to all units. Urgent update from Memorial Hospital. On-call surgeon Marcus James has not arrived. Description follows. Black male, mid-30s, driving a black sedan with New York plates. Rick froze mid-search, his partner shooting him a sharp look. Wait, Rick muttered, his brow furrowing. He checked the ID he had confiscated earlier, his face draining of color as he realized the truth. Back at the hospital, Chief Monroe's pager buzzed with an incoming call. He answered immediately, his voice strained. The nurse on the line informed him there was no sign of Dr. James, and they were running out of options. The chief's frustration boiled over. Find him, he barked, his voice echoing through the sterile hallway. Rick stood motionless by Marcus's car, the weight of his mistake sinking in. He exchanged a glance with his partner, both realizing the severity of their actions. As Rick reached for his radio, his earlier smugness vanished, replaced by a growing sense of dread. Rick's hands trembled slightly as he raised his radio. The smug confidence that had earlier defined him was gone, replaced by visible unease. Dispatch, this is Officer Rick Thompson. We've detained the surgeon, he stammered, his voice lacking its previous edge. There was a long pause on the other end before a sharp reply cut through. What do you mean, detained? That surgeon is critical. Release him immediately. Rick exchanged a panicked look with his partner, who muttered under his breath, "We screwed up, Rick." They quickly opened the back door of the squad car, but Marcus didn't move. His piercing gaze locked onto Rick, his frustration barely concealed. "Undo these cuffs. Now," Marcus said, his voice cold and steady. Rick fumbled with the keys, his usual bravado completely gone. As the handcuffs clicked open, Marcus rubbed his wrists, the red marks a painful reminder of the precious time lost. "You wasted minutes. Minutes that could mean life or death for that boy," he said, his voice cutting through the night air. Rick mumbled an apology, but Marcus ignored him, climbing into his car and speeding off. Back at the hospital, Chief Monroe was pacing when a nurse handed him a phone. "Chief, it's for you. Urgent." "Monroe," he answered gruffly. The voice on the other end was Rick's, shaky and desperate. "Chief, we detained the surgeon. He's on his way now. I swear we didn't know." Monroe's face turned ashen. "You what?" His voice rose, reverberating through the quiet hallway. "You detained the man who's supposed to save my son?" His grip on the phone tightened as fury overtook him. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Before Rick could stammer a reply, Monroe hung up and stormed toward the hospital entrance. Outside, Marcus arrived at the hospital in a screech of tires, barely parking before leaping out of his car. Chief Monroe, standing near the entrance, saw him and rushed over. "Doctor? James," he started, his voice cracking with emotion. "I'm so sorry. My officers—" Marcus cut him off with a raised hand, his expression unreadable. "Save the apologies. Right now, your son needs me, and that's all I care about." Without waiting for a response, Marcus strode past Monroe, his focus entirely on the task ahead. Monroe stood frozen, watching the man he'd wronged enter the hospital, carrying the weight of his son's life on his shoulders. The operating room was a flurry of activity as Marcus scrubbed in, his mind focused entirely on the task ahead. The delay had made an already critical situation even more dire, but Marcus pushed the anger and frustration to the back of his mind. His hands were steady, his eyes sharp as he entered the OR where the surgical team was already prepped. The young boy, pale and fragile, lay on the table surrounded by beeping monitors that painted a grim picture of his condition. Marcus wasted no time. "Vitals?" he asked briskly, his voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. A nurse responded with a rundown of the boy's deteriorating state, and Marcus nodded, already visualizing the procedure in his mind. "We're behind, but we can save him," he said, with a confidence that steadied the team. Every movement he made was purposeful, every instruction precise. The room, though tense, became a symphony of coordinated effort under his leadership. The minutes stretched into hours as Marcus worked tirelessly to repair the internal damage threatening the boy's life. His hands moved with a blend of urgency and precision, navigating the delicate procedure with the skill of someone who had performed miracles before. He blocked out everything except the task at hand, the harsh lights above him, the occasional hushed exchanges between nurses, and even the weight of the injustice he'd just endured. All that mattered now was saving this boy. Outside the OR, Chief Monroe paced the hallway, his face lined with worry. He glanced at the clock repeatedly, each passing second feeling like an eternity. The same officers who had detained Marcus stood awkwardly nearby, their earlier smugness replaced with shame. Monroe had avoided addressing them, too consumed by fear for his son to unleash the fury brewing inside him. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, the OR doors swung open and Marcus emerged, still in his surgical gear. His exhaustion was evident, but his expression carried a quiet determination. Monroe rushed forward, his voice trembling. "Doctor." "James, my son." Marcus met the chief's desperate gaze and gave a single nod. He's stable. The damage was extensive, but we were able to stop the bleeding and repair the injuries. He's going to be okay." The chief's knees nearly buckled with relief as tears welled in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for saving my boy." Marcus regarded him for a moment, his exhaustion and anger tempered by the weight of the moment. "You should thank the team, and next time maybe think twice about who you're trusting to enforce the law." Without waiting for a reply, he turned and walked away, leaving Monroe to grapple with a mix of gratitude and guilt. The fallout from the night's events began to unravel almost immediately, sending ripples through the police department and the local community. Back at the precinct, Chief Monroe wasted no time summoning Rick and his partner into his office. The normally composed chief was livid, his face a mask of barely restrained fury. Rick stood stiffly, trying to justify his actions, but Monroe cut him off. "You detained the man who saved my son's life," Monroe said, his voice low and dangerous. "You wasted valuable time, and it could have cost him everything. You want to explain to me how pulling over a surgeon on his way to an emergency was justified?" Rick stammered, his earlier bravado completely gone. "Sir, we thought he was acting suspicious," he muttered. His partner standing beside him remained silent, his face pale. Monroe's glare could have cut through steel. "Suspicious? Because he was driving a nice car? Because he didn't look like what you expected a surgeon to look like? I'm suspending you both, effective immediately, pending an investigation. Get out of my sight." Word of the incident didn't stay within the walls of the precinct. A nurse from the hospital, moved by the injustice Marcus had faced, shared the story on social media. Within hours, the post went viral, sparking outrage across the community and beyond. The story of a black surgeon being detained on his way to save a life resonated deeply, especially given the critical role he played in saving the chief's son. Hashtags like "Plaque our surgeon stopped" and "Das Justice for Marcus" began trending, with thousands expressing their anger at the racial profiling Marcus had endured. At the hospital, Marcus remained professional, though the weight of the night's events hung heavy on him. Colleagues approached him with words of support, but Marcus was too drained to engage fully. He replayed the events over and over in his mind, the humiliation, the time lost, the desperation he'd felt in that holding cell. Yet he also felt a sense of purpose beginning to build. This wasn't just about him, it was about addressing the systemic issues that allowed incidents like this to happen. As the social media storm gained traction, the police department faced mounting pressure to respond. Protesters gathered outside the precinct, demanding accountability. Local news stations picked up the story, further amplifying the calls for action. Rick and his partner, now suspended, became the face of the department's failings, their actions condemned as an egregious example of racial bias. Chief Monroe held a press conference to address the growing backlash. Standing before a crowd of reporters, he expressed his deepest apologies to Marcus and pledged to implement immediate changes within the department. "What happened to Dr. James is unacceptable," Monroe said, his voice heavy with regret. "As police officers, we are sworn to protect and serve, not to discriminate. We will take every measure to ensure this never happens again." Despite Monroe's efforts, the damage was done. The community's trust in the department had been shaken, and the demand for systemic reform grew louder. Marcus, though reluctant to step into the spotlight, agreed to an interview with a major news outlet. Sitting across from the journalist, he spoke with quiet strength. "This isn't just about me," he said. "It's about a system that allows bias to influence decisions. It's about ensuring that the next black man rushing to save a life isn't stopped because someone assumes he doesn't belong." The interview struck a chord, further galvanizing support for Marcus and the movement his story had sparked. Across the nation, conversations about racial profiling and police accountability gained renewed urgency, and Marcus found himself at the center of a fight much larger than himself. The events of the night left Marcus James grappling with a whirlwind of emotions, anger, exhaustion, and a deep sense of disillusionment. Alone in his apartment after a long shift at the hospital, he sat at his kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. The silence of the early morning felt oppressive, amplifying the thoughts racing through his mind. His gaze lingered on the window, where the city lights blinked against the dark sky, a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous hours. He couldn't stop replaying the incident in his head. The flashing lights, the cold handcuffs, and the condescension in Rick's voice. It wasn't the first time he'd been judged by the color of his skin, but it was the first time that judgment had come so close to costing a life. The image of the police chief's son lying on the operating table was etched into his mind, a sobering reminder of how close tragedy had been. The question gnawed at him. How many others had faced similar treatment without the platform or the privilege to push back? Determined not to let the injustice fester into bitterness, Marcus resolved to channel his anger into action. He began journaling his experience, not only as a way to process his emotions, but also to document the event in detail. The process was cathartic, his pen flowing with a mixture of frustration and purpose. Writing reminded him of the power of his voice, a tool he'd used to educate medical students and advocate for patients. Now he realized that voice could serve a broader purpose. The next morning, Marcus took a deep breath and clicked Post on a heartfelt account of the incident, shared across his social media platforms. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Messages of support flooded in, ranging from friends and colleagues to complete strangers who had faced similar injustices. His story became a rallying cry, shedding light on the intersection of racial bias and professional identity. Marcus realized he was no longer just speaking for himself. He was giving voice to countless others who had been silenced. Encouraged by the outpouring of solidarity, Marcus began taking deliberate steps to push for systemic change. He accepted an invitation to speak on a panel discussing racial bias in law enforcement and the medical field. The event was broadcast nationally, and Marcus shared his story with a measured, eloquent resolve that captivated viewers. "Bias doesn't just hurt individuals," he said, his tone steady but firm. "It endangers entire communities, and when it happens, especially within systems of power, the consequences can be catastrophic." Marcus's words resonated far beyond the panel. Civil rights organizations reached out, eager to collaborate. The medical community, too, rallied behind him, recognizing the unique challenges faced by Black professionals in high-stakes environments. Marcus became a sought-after speaker, appearing on news programs and at conferences to advocate for reform. Though the spotlight was intense, Marcus remained grounded. His reflections during quiet moments at home kept him focused on the bigger picture. He understood the weight of the platform he now had and embraced the responsibility with humility. It wasn't enough to raise awareness. He wanted tangible change. He began drafting a proposal for a community-driven initiative aimed at fostering dialogue between law enforcement and marginalized communities. Through it all, Marcus's determination never wavered. He had turned his pain into a movement, using his voice and platform to push for a better future. In the darkest moments of that night, he had felt powerless, but now he stood empowered, knowing he was making a difference not just for himself, but for the many who would come after him. Chief Alan Monroe couldn't shake the events of that night. While relieved that his son was alive, he felt the heavy weight of shame for how his department had handled the situation. Watching Marcus on the news, speaking with dignity and grace despite the injustice he faced, made the chief confront his own complicity. He had always prided himself on leading an ethical force, but Rick's actions and his department's failures shattered that belief. Monroe decided he couldn't let the incident pass without taking responsibility. At a press conference held in the hospital's conference room, surrounded by cameras and reporters, he publicly apologized to Marcus. "As a father, I can't express how grateful I am to Dr. James for saving my son's life," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. "But as a police chief, I am deeply sorry for what he endured at the hands of my officers. This was unacceptable, and we must do better." The chief pledged immediate action. Anti-bias training for the entire force would be mandatory. New policies for community engagement and accountability were announced, and an independent review board would oversee complaints against officers. Monroe also revealed that Rick had been suspended pending further investigation, making it clear that such behavior would not be tolerated. What surprised everyone, however, was Monroe's next step. He reached out to Marcus personally, requesting a meeting. Marcus agreed, though he was skeptical. When they met in the hospital cafeteria, Monroe's demeanor was far from authoritative. It was humble. "Dr. James," he began, "I owe you more than just words. I want to understand how we can fix this, not just for my department, but for our community." What followed was an honest and sometimes painful discussion. Marcus didn't hold back, describing how racial profiling wasn't just an isolated incident, but a systemic problem that needed addressing at every level. To his surprise, Monroe listened without defensiveness, taking notes and asking questions. By the end of their meeting, the chief proposed working together to implement meaningful change. Over the following months, Marcus and Monroe formed an unlikely partnership. They co-hosted town halls, inviting residents and law enforcement to have open, honest conversations about race and policing. Marcus shared his story, and Monroe detailed the steps his department was taking to rebuild trust. Slowly but surely, the divide began to narrow. For Marcus, this collaboration wasn't about forgiveness. It was about progress. And for Monroe, it was a chance to show that accountability and humility could pave the way for redemption. Together, they proved that even the deepest wounds could begin to heal when approached with courage and commitment. Months had passed since that fateful night, but the impact of the incident continued to ripple through the community and beyond. Rick's termination from the police force had sent a clear message. Actions rooted in bias and prejudice would no longer be swept under the rug. The story of Marcus's arrest and his life-saving surgery had gone viral, sparking debates nationwide about racial profiling and systemic reform. For Marcus, life carried on, though not unchanged. He still worked long hours at the hospital, performing surgeries and mentoring young doctors. But he had become more than just a surgeon. Invitations poured in for him to speak at universities, conferences, and community events, where he passionately advocated for systemic changes in policing and healthcare equity. One evening, as Marcus returned home from a long day at the hospital, he found an envelope waiting on his desk. The handwriting was neat, but unfamiliar. Inside was a letter from Chief Monroe's son, Ethan. "Dear Dr. James," it began. "I don't remember much about that night, but I know one thing. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you. My dad told me everything about what happened, and I can't imagine how you stayed so strong through it all. I want you to know that your courage inspires me, and I hope to grow up and help others the way you helped me. Thank you for saving my life." Marcus sat quietly, the letter resting in his hands. Ethan's words were a poignant reminder of why he had chosen this path, to make a difference, one life at a time. Meanwhile, the town had begun to see tangible changes. The police department's new training programs and accountability measures were a direct result of Monroe and Marcus's partnership. Community leaders praised the progress, and even skeptics began to see hope for a future where justice was not skewed by prejudice. One evening, as Marcus walked through the hospital's brightly lit corridors, he caught sight of a television in the waiting room. The news anchor was discussing a national initiative inspired by Marcus's story, aimed at combating racial profiling and fostering better relationships between law enforcement and communities of color. Marcus couldn't help but feel a surge of pride and hope. Before heading into the OR for another surgery, Marcus took a moment to pause by the large windows overlooking the city. The lights twinkled below, a reminder of the countless lives, stories, and challenges in this world. He knew his work wasn't done. There were still battles to fight, lives to save, and voices to amplify. But tonight, as he stepped into the operating room, he felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The memory of that harrowing night would stay with him forever, but so would the knowledge that he had turned pain into progress and injustice into action. Marcus adjusted his mask, ready to do what he did best: save another life.